If the international system is anarchic, meaning that there's no world government, global police force, no higher authority telling countries what to do, then why don't states constantly fight? Why don't they just ignore trade rules, ditch climate commitments, or backstab one another at every turn? After all, if everyone's just out for themselves, isn't conflict inevitable? Despite the so-called anarchy in the international system, we actually see lots of cooperation in global politics. Countries join international organizations, follow treaty obligations, and even compromise national interests. And while conflict certainly exists, we also see a remarkable amount of cooperation through trade, diplomacy, and multilateral agreements that realism alone can't fully explain. That's the paradox of cooperation, and it's at the heart of neoliberalism, a theory of international relations. Just a quick clarification, though. When we talk about neoliberalism in this context, we're not referring to the economic ideology associated with deregulation, privatization, market liberalization, and so on. Ideas usually linked to figures like Milton Friedman and Margaret Thatcher. In international relations, neoliberalism is a theory that explains how and why states cooperate under conditions of anarchy, particularly through shared institutions and norms. Neoliberalism emerged as a school of thought in international relations in the 1970s, a turbulent decade in global politics. The United States was reeling from the war in Vietnam. The Cold War was in full swing, and the global economy was in crisis. Meanwhile, the influence of international institutions like the United Nations and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, what would later become the World Trade Organization, was expanding. And at the same time, a new wave of realism called neorealism or structural realism was on the rise. Neorealists argued that because the international system is anarchic and states seek survival, cooperation is rare and fragile. In their view, states care more about relative gains, what they get compared to others, than absolute gains. Neoliberal scholars like Robert Cohane and Joseph Nye accepted many of neorealism's assumptions. Yes, the system is anarchic. Yes, states are rational and self-interested. But they pushed back against the idea that cooperation was inherently unlikely. In their groundbreaking work, Power and Interdependence, published in 1977, Cohane and Nye introduced a new framework, one that recognized the growing complexity of international interactions and the growing importance of institutions in interdependence. Neoliberalism emerged as a response to neorealism. It doesn't deny that power matters, but it insists that the world has changed. Today, states are embedded in webs of interaction, from trade and finance to environmental regimes and international law. These structures, neoliberals argue, don't eliminate anarchy, but they do help manage it. And that makes cooperation possible, even beneficial, for states acting in their own interests. In short, neoliberalism reframes the question, asking not, why don't states cooperate, but rather, under what conditions do they cooperate? And what role do international institutions play in making that cooperation work? Neoliberalism begins with a set of foundational points it shares with realism. The international system is anarchic. There is no world government to enforce rules or settle disputes. States remain the primary actors, and they're understood as rational and self-interested entities seeking to survive and prosper. But from here, the neoliberal perspective begins to diverge. First, neoliberals argue that states are concerned primarily with absolute gains, that is, how much they benefit in total, rather than in relative gains, how much they gain compared to others. If cooperation benefits both parties, even if unequally, it's still worth pursuing. This focus on absolute gains opens the door to durable cooperation, especially in economic and environmental areas where mutual benefits are obvious. Unlike neorealists, neoliberals believe states aren't trapped in a zero-sum game. Second, neoliberalism emphasizes the importance of repeated interactions. States aren't just interacting once, they're engaged in ongoing relationships through trade agreements, climate negotiations, and diplomatic ties. This shadow of the future encourages cooperation because today's decisions affect tomorrow's outcomes. Neoliberals also highlight the role of information and transparency. One of the main barriers to cooperation is uncertainty. States may fear being cheated. But if mechanisms are in place to monitor behavior and share information, Neoliberals contend trust becomes possible even among self-interested actors. Finally, neoliberalism places strong emphasis on the role of institutions. Institutions, both formal organizations like the World Trade Organization or the United Nations, and informal regimes like arms control norms, help facilitate cooperation by reducing transaction costs, clarifying expectations, and making defection more costly. In other words, while the world may be anarchic, it's not chaotic. Institutions, norms, and mutual interests can structure anarchy in ways that make cooperation not just possible, but likely, especially in a world characterized by complex interdependence. So for neoliberals, international institutions are the key to mitigating anarchy and enabling cooperation. Importantly, by institutions, we don't just mean physical organizations like the United Nations or the World Trade Organization, though those are important examples. In IR theory, institutions also include the rules, norms, procedures, and expectations that guide state behavior. They're the agreed-upon rules of the game. Institutions play several crucial roles in facilitating cooperation. First, they reduce transaction costs. Think of it this way. Negotiating an international agreement from scratch every time would be slow and expensive. But institutions create standing procedures, common rules, and forums that make interactions more efficient. Institutions also increase transparency. They provide a space for states to share information, report actions, and verify compliance. This reduces the uncertainty that can make cooperation risky. Third, institutions establish expectations. By codifying norms and procedures, they shape what behavior is considered acceptable and what counts as a violation. These shared expectations help stabilize relationships and reduce misunderstandings. Institutions can also impose costs for cheating. Even without a world government, institutions can coordinate responses when a member breaks the rules, through sanctions, loss of reputation, or exclusion from future benefits. And finally, institutions facilitate continuity. Even as governments change, institutions remain. They provide a platform for long-term engagement, helping states build patterns of cooperation over time. Examples of these kinds of institutions abound. The World Trade Organization's dispute settlement system allows states to settle trade disagreements without resorting to retaliation. The International Monetary Fund provides financial assistance, but also sets conditions to ensure economic reform. And climate agreements like the Paris Accord provide a framework for monitoring and reporting emissions, even if enforcement is limited. To neoliberals, these institutions don't necessarily override state sovereignty, but they do help manage the challenge of an anarchic world. By lowering the costs of cooperation and raising the costs of defection, institutions make it rational for states to work together, even in the absence of a global enforcer. Neoliberalism also reshapes how we think about power and priorities in international relations, especially through the concept of complex interdependence, introduced by Cohen and Nye's book Power and Interdependence. In contrast to the realist view of a world dominated by military power and security competition, complex interdependence describes a global system where states, and increasingly non-state actors, are linked through multiple overlapping ties. These ties constrain behavior and shift the way power operates. Complex interdependence has three key features. Under realism, states are the only meaningful actors and interact primarily through diplomacy and military force. But under complex interdependence, there are multiple channels of interaction, state to state, but also between international organizations, NGOs, corporations, and even individuals. Consider how a global issue like climate change involves not just governments, but also scientific bodies, transnational advocacy networks, and multinational firms. These actors shape outcomes and influence policy. Realism tends to rank military security as the top concern, but under complex interdependence, no single issue dominates. Economic policy, environmental regulation, public health, and technology are all seen as vital. Depending upon the context, any of these may take precedence. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, global health cooperation, not military alliances, became a central focus for international engagement. In a world characterized by complex interdependence, military force is often less useful or even counterproductive. States are linked by trade, investment, and shared institutions, and have strong incentives to avoid conflict. This doesn't mean war disappears, but it does become just one option among many, and often not the most effective one. Instead, economic sanctions, international law, or reputational costs often play a greater role in shaping state behavior. Complex interdependence helps explain why states cooperate even without global authority, and why issues like trade, environment, and technology have become so central to international relations. It's also a way of understanding how power in international relations operates in more subtle terms. Under complex interdependence, power isn't just about coercion, who has the bigger army or more nuclear weapons. It's about agenda setting, rule-making, and institutional design. Power is about shaping the context within which decisions are made, what issues make it onto the global agenda, whose voices are heard, and which interests get protected through international rules and norms. Despite its widespread influence in international relations, neoliberalism has faced substantial critiques, many of which point to its blind spots around power, inequality, and institutional bias. First, realist critics maintain that neoliberalism underestimates the enduring role of power politics in global affairs. While it focuses on cooperation and absolute gains, critics argue that power still matters, sometimes overwhelmingly so. Military strength, strategic dominance, and coercive influence remain central to many state interactions, especially in security and conflict-prone regions. In other words, just because cooperation is possible doesn't mean that power politics has disappeared. Critics also maintain that neoliberalism is overly optimistic about the effectiveness of international institutions. While institutions can facilitate cooperation, they don't guarantee it. States often violate agreements or selectively comply with rules, especially when enforcement mechanisms are weak or when compliance imposes domestic costs. The Paris Climate Agreement, for instance, relies heavily on voluntary commitments. States can join, leave, or renege with relatively few consequences. For critics, this raises doubt about the ability of institutions to meaningfully shape behavior without stronger enforcement powers. And even when institutions function as intended, they often reflect and reinforce existing power imbalances. Wealthier, more powerful states tend to dominate the agenda, shape the rules, and enjoy greater influence within international organizations. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, for example, have voting systems that favor the global north, while the countries in the global south often face conditionalities that limit their economic autonomy. Neoliberalism insufficiently accounts for how these asymmetries skew outcomes in favor of dominant actors. Further, even while neoliberalism acknowledges the importance of non-state actors, NGOs, multinational corporations, international institutions, and the like, it nevertheless remains fundamentally state-centric. It tends to treat states as unitary, rational actors, overlooking internal politics, contestation, and the way state interests are constructed and contested. This limits its ability to fully capture the complexity of international politics, where non-state actors often shape agendas, mobilize resources, or disrupt cooperation altogether. Neoliberalism also tends to privilege Western perspectives on international order. Many of the institutions it celebrates, liberal trade regimes, financial institutions, global governance bodies, and so on, emerge from Western experiences and priorities, especially in the post-World War II context. This can obscure or marginalize alternative worldviews and models of governance, particularly those shaped by non-Western histories or post-colonial experiences. While neoliberalism has historically centered on Western-led institutions, it's worth noting the growing importance of regional institutions in the global south, like ASEAN, the African Union, or Mercosur. These bodies offer alternative models of cooperation, often grounded in principles of regional solidarity, non-intervention, or consensus-based decision-making that differ from traditional Western frameworks. Finally, neoliberalism has limited engagement with critical and structural theories. It pays little attention to how global capitalism shapes inequality or how issues like gender, race, and class influence the international system. Feminist, Marxist, and postcolonial theorists argue that neoliberalism treats the global system as a neutral arena of cooperation rather than as a contested space marked by structural exploitation and exclusion. In short, while neoliberalism provides a powerful lens for understanding how and when states cooperate, it often overlooks who benefits most from that cooperation and who's left out or disadvantaged by the existing global order. As a mainstream theory of international relations, neoliberalism offers a compelling explanation for why and how cooperation happens, even in the anarchic conditions of the international system. It reminds us that states aren't just trapped in cycles of fear and conflict. They can and do often find ways to work together, especially when institutions help lower the costs and risks of cooperation. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and as always, thanks for watching.